Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, of course, to Donal Ryan, who has
My pleasure.
been out and about a lot talking about your latest novel. And I think this is one that seems to have risen to the top, seems that one that people have really gone for. And is that because of the women?
I wonder, yeah. Thank God for women. I think so, because this novel actually, it really feels like a bit of a gift from the universe or from God or from my deceased descendants or somebody, because I was sitting in my attic room in abject panic because I'd written a novel over about 2 years that kind of hadn't worked out. But I didn't know it hadn't worked out until it had gone to my editor and publisher, and they said, no, no, this novel really needs an awful lot of work, and I just couldn't face it. I really couldn't face it, but I no choice really but to contemplate taking this thing apart and fixing it. And I heard a voice, and it sounded very like my grandmother, even though I know most likely the voice came from myself, but it did have the timbre and tone of my grandmother, and she was saying, "That's Donal, why don't you write a book about women living in a house together but no men?" I said, that's a great idea. And it really did feel, now I know this sounds mealy-moly and it's not really true, but it did feel as though the story was dictated to me through my skylight. And it took about 12 weeks to write the first draft. And the finished book isn't very much altered from the first draft, unusually. Normally you'll have fairly radical changes draft by draft, but nothing changed very much. It's really, there was no effort involved. It just felt like pure joy, the whole process.
That seems incredible to me, because one of the things about your prose is that it's very, very clear, very, very beautifully crafted. So when you say there's a voice whispering in your ear, I think, can that really be the case?
I think I wondered the same thing, Camilla, yeah, but I think it felt that way, it really did.
Yeah. And voice is very much part of your writing, it has been from the very beginning, hasn't it? It's always a voice, several voices from many different generations, different backgrounds, and it's a very strong characteristic. And is this something that, is that the way your books come to you? Is that something you do deliberately?
Absolutely. It really, voice, the idea of a spoken voice, of a story being almost dictated directly to a reader by a narrator who was a living presence in the book, is what kind of saved my idea of myself as a writer, because I spent years and years living in a haunted apartment with, a clerical job in the civil service, and I was a really cliched, typical, frustrated artist. I had a broken heart, and I had various girlfriends and friends living in the apartment, but mostly I was alone, and I had this huge amount of time and space, and I had a resident ghost who was my friend. With all these things that were feeding into me being a writer. It was the perfect climate for being a writer. It was perfect, and I couldn't write beyond a few pages ever, because everything I wrote just felt so contrived and so forced. And until I started to write in the voice of my own family and friends, and my own voice, and started to write and started to address the reader directly, nothing I ever wrote felt real, because I had a strange notion of what a writer was. Even though my childhood home was full of books, I still had this strange idea that a writer was a slightly posh middle-class English person. And that's the way I should write. And that's the kind of narrative voice I should have. And I should be very remote and cold and omniscient as a narrator. And I should try to just, to create these florid scenes, and then try to people them with people who were just unbelievable, And it did feel literally unbelievable. And I always felt sick after a while. And it always just felt wrong, And the very simple expedient of writing in my own voice just saved me. And I think there's real power in it. And I remember my first American review, one of the first reviews I got from an American was on a blog called Books and Bowel Movements. And and she was declarative about it. Her opening comment was, "The Spinning Heart is the worst book ever written." Now, she didn't just say the worst novel ever written, it was the worst books of all the books ever written, About 50 million books, it was the worst. And she went on to delineate her arguments, as to why exactly it was the worst book ever written. And they were all fairly hurtful until the very end. She said, "And I'm so sick of hearing people praise this guy for writing in a demotic voice, because all he's doing is using the slang and grit of his own people." And I thought that was beautiful. And I actually asked Doubleday, I said, "Will you please put that blurb on the next book? Because it's just so lovely. The slang, I was so proud of that, So she was redeemed. I forgive her for the terrible review because of that last line.
Yes, it's good that nice to talk about that, because I think particularly in the Queen of Dirt Island, your latest one, it's the voices that really make that you perceive the characters through the way they talk, and the way that Nana talks is amazing, and that is one whole kind of register, isn't it? And then you go through to. But it's striking also that in your writing in other books, there are people who are more or less inarticulate, but they have this kind of interior monologue in which you write their stories.
That's very important, actually, to me as an idea about people, because and we're all guilty of it. We're all guilty of writing people off without thinking about it. You know, I mean, if somebody is very quiet and very introverted, we'll walk past them, and you know, I mean, everyone's polite and nice, obviously, but it's very easy to kind of forget that everybody has an inner discourse, and very often it's quite chaotic. And you know, there's no way of knowing what's going on inside somebody. And so any attempted explication of another human's interiority, it's always guesswork. But I was obsessed with the idea for ages of really quiet people, because I knew so many growing up, you know, and where I'm from, you know, countrymen, real countrymen, who might never have married, and with a very, very narrow social circle, and with a very, you know, what would seem like a constrained and stymied life, but for them could be a very happy life.
So would you say that is another thing that's very striking about your writing, that when the sense of place and the sense of the people who've lived in those places and have been living the same lives for generations, but who've not previously turned up in fiction.
Yeah.
Is it true to say that, or is that a bit of an overstatement?
I think so. I mean, I think you see these kind of outlier characters all through fiction. I think, especially in Irish fiction, you see people like Desmond Hogan and Claire Keegan and Claire Kilroy. All sorts of writers have done it. But I really wanted to I wanted to give a voice to somebody who would otherwise be voiceless. I remember writing a story based on the character of my wife's late uncle, Dan Murphy. And Dan was a very quiet man. And when Dan spoke, he really meant what he said. He never meant small talk. You know, he'd never sit down and talk about the weather or talk about inane things, even though that kind of small talk is lovely. It's a lovely social lubricant and it's very important. But Dan would sit down and he'd say, Donny. And he mightn't say anything for a while, and then he'd go, "Do you ever see a ghost?" And then we'd have a big, long conversation about ghosts. Or else he'd say, "Do you know?" And he'd name a person that he knew, that he might have a kind of, a historic enmity with, and he'd explain to me why he didn't like that person. And he'd be very profound about it and very serious. You know, there'd never be a wasted word. You know, it's fantastic. But mostly he was silent, and he spent most of his days alone, but always seemed very happy and contented. You know, it was amazing. Like, he didn't have any of the usual accepted trappings of contentment or success in life. He was mostly alone, and he went into the fields around his house, and he'd sketch animals. Yeah. And no one knew this until he died. And we found, his sisters found huge reams of sketches, like really, really good quality sketches of rabbits and foxes and voles in his locker. It's amazing.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned The Spinning Heart, your first novel, which seemed to sort of arrive, that was the point at which you started winning awards, and there were quite a few of them. I have them listed here, but I probably won't read them out because it's so long. But I wondered if you'd tell us which of the awards that were that you've had meant the most to you as a writer.
Well, it's hard to say. It's lovely to win awards, but there's always a kind of attendant guilt about awards, because there's always other writers, eligible for the same award who don't win it, and then you kind of feel as though you've been singled out, sometimes unfairly, and somebody has to be disappointed, and it's horrible in a way, but in another way, it's great that books and publishers and booksellers can be celebrated, and it does seem kind of a natural way of doing it. But I think the first award I won was Newcomer of the Year at the Irish Book Awards, and it just felt so amazing because I had no idea it was going to happen. Literally no idea, and I had no speech prepared, and I got lost on the way to the stage. I went off in a queer kind of arc out around the side of the tables, and I ended up. It was in the RDS, this huge room. I ended up in the shadows. Nobody could see me, and they were waiting on the stage for me to go up with my trophy, and I was gone. And luckily, Marianne O'Connor, the agent, came and just pulled me up. Donal, where the hell are you going? She led me to the stage. Oh, I feel like an awful idiot. Sounded like an idiot, and it was great though. It was just such a lovely feeling.
Yeah, so that made you say to yourself, "I am a writer."
Kind of did, yeah.
But also now between however many novels, but also a volume of short stories. And it's very interesting the way that the Queen of Dirt Island is constructed, is almost like a sequence of short stories, particular length of each chapter. Isn't that right?
That's right, yeah.
So where is your heart? Is it in the novel or in the short story?
I think in the novel for sure, because as my friend and colleague Mike McCormick has said, and it's a very profound thing he said about the novel, novels offer a wonderful accommodation to writers. There's so much space in a novel, you know, and you can allow yourself to go a little bit wrong in the novel.
Yeah.
And you can leave the mistakes extant. It can be published with things that are wrong, because there's no point trying to hone something to perfection. It's never going to happen. But with a short story, there's no real hiding place. And every word has to bear far more weight. And every phrase has to be, you know, so much more completely considered. And whereas with a novel, you can you can allow indulgences here and there. You know, you can go a little bit wrong, you can go off on tangents, you can be digressive, and it's okay. But with a short story, you can't. Really, it's a much more disciplined craft, I think. And it's much harder. I mean, that short story collection nearly finished my writing career. I remember at one stage, Anne-Marie coming home, and I was lying on the floor in a fetal position with my knees tucked up, and I was rocking like a baby. I was crying tears, and she was there going, "Oh, for fuck, what's wrong with you?" She kind of knew she could get up there and finish the short story collection. I couldn't do it. For ages, I stopped. I said, "No, it's just too hard. Short stories are too. I can't do them. I just can't do them." And it was easy when there was nothing at stake. You know, when I never had a deal, and you know it was fine, and nobody cared, and no one would ever read them. It was fine. It flew out. But then when I'd been paid money in advance for work I hadn't done, and the work I had to do was write short stories, it became almost impossible. Yeah. But I got through it, and Marie coaxed me through it, and I got there in the end. But you know, it can be at times. It sounds ridiculous to say it, you know, but it can be hard physical work sometimes. You know? I know it sounds ridiculous, really.
So obviously, your family, or your wife in particular, maybe your sisters, have had your siblings growing up. Did they have a big influence on you?
Oh, absolutely.
As a would-be writer.
For sure. Can I just backtrack slightly and say I have done physical work, actually. I know what it feels like, so I know it doesn't feel the same. Anyway, absolutely. I owe my family everything. First of all, because my parents, who, when I was growing up, you know, I mean, it was the 80s and late 70s and 80s, and no one had money. And, you know, we lived in a normal small house, semi-detached in a small housing estate in a village. And Dad drove a van, and Mum worked now and again in bookies, just like Eileen in the book. And so there was no spare money at all. But they did manage to fill the house with books. And there was a rotation of books, you know, books would line the rooms, and then new books would arrive in job lots, from auctions and, you know, house clearances and all sorts of places. And so there was that foundation of stories in the house. And we kind of had a habit of reading in bed, my sister and I. And I remember being very young, and long before I went to school, spelling words out from my mum, and she'd tell me what the word meant from the kitchen. And so, you know, this thing was echoing through the house. It was lovely. And so it was always there. But I think the way my family speak, and the way we communicate, and the way my friends communicate, you know, for me, fed into an ease when it came to creating stories. But it did take me all those years to get to that point. And I still don't know why, you know, I had that waste of time, really. Why it didn't occur to me to use the language and lexicon of my own people to make stories.
It seems that was something quite new when The Spinning Heart was first published. This hadn't quite been done. You mentioned Claire Keegan. She was around the same time, Mike McCormick and Solar Bones. But before that, it was more urban Ireland. It wasn't country Ireland, and it wasn't the voice of country Ireland.
I think so. I mean, I definitely was influenced by Edna O'Brien and John McGahern and people who did that, you know, who took something of the kind of the spirit and energy, and sometimes the dark, negative energy of rural Ireland, and parlay that into fiction really powerfully. You know, I mean, to the point where their books were banned. I mean, my paternal grandmother had an underground railroad of books from me. She lived in a cottage. There were caretaker farmers on a hillside in North Tipperary, and you know, she had a few small acres and a few animals, but she had a collection of banned books behind a couch in the cottage.
Long list, I think.
A long list it was, yeah. I mean, she had Kate O'Brien, John McGahern, she had Edna, She had all these people, and all of the big shots of the area, parish priests would come to the house, barristers, judges, solicitors, all the grandeur of the area would walk up to Boreen from the road. There was you couldn't drive up, you had to walk to Boreen, and lean in over the half door to ask May, could they borrow the book? And she'd give them, and she'd ask them their credentials, and she might loan them a book. It was a great thing, it was a serious risk to take, really, because they were properly illegal,
they were on the
contraband,
index
yeah.
of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you say about the darkness. I mean, your novels are, the words that people use to describe your novels are beautiful and lovely and all the rest of it and all, but there's a lot of anger in your books. Is that your anger?
Well, I think it's important not to write in anger, but it's sometimes you will sublimate your own disgust at how things are in the world into fiction, and I think that's one of the points of fiction, is a pressure valve and a way of illuminating certain things, in a way of trying to come to terms with some things and make things seem real for people. But for example, when I wrote Spinning Heart, I mean, I was in pretty much the exact same situation as the main character, Bobby Mahan, in that, I mean, like everybody else, I wasn't alone in this, of course. It was very difficult to make ends meet in a month, and so our household debt was mounting, and we were kind of starting to sink a little bit, like everybody, and starting to panic a bit. And, it didn't seem as though much help was coming. We always had, I suppose, in Ireland, a neoliberal vision from government, and, it was kind of, nothing was really happening very much to ameliorate the situation for ordinary working people. Things were getting worse and worse. And so that, I suppose, the fact that I was in the situation Bobby was in, made it in a way difficult to accurately describe the situation. I think that's why the book is the way it is, why it's fragmented, why there are many voices, and why I tried to be kind of democratic about it. I tried to give everybody a voice. And in the end, it ended up being a kind of a chorus. But I think, not quite a cacophony. I think it is, there is something about it that makes sense to people.
Yeah. These are very distinct voices, and they're not just Irish voices. But was it through that you eventually came back to your own place? And obviously place is a very important part of your writing too, and you could almost draw a map from the Queen of Dirt Island, couldn't you, as to where they all live in relation to each other and where the towns are and everything. So that's another thing that's been, you came back to that, really, once you decided you could do the writing of your own people.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I do credit the landscape of my native place, North Tipperary, with an awful lot of, of the ease. Kind of, I feel comfortable in my imagination in that place, and I know we all do it. I remember I wrote a small piece for The Guardian a few years ago, and about my memories of Christmas in childhood and where I'm from, and there was a discussion beneath my article, between some note-alls about the article itself, and they were using all sorts of words I hadn't heard before about my article. But the upshot was, one person was arguing that it was ridiculously nostalgic, and that nostalgia was a form of lying to oneself, and nostalgia was a form of dishonesty. But I mean, I genuinely do. I mean, I do go back to my childhood place in my imagination for that sense of safety and succor and being cosseted, and the sense that, the world is a lovely place, because everyone in the place I'm from in my childhood seemed kind and protecting, and it just seemed like such a lovely, kind place. And it still is, it really is. I mean, I see reviews sometimes of my novel Australian Flowers, and they say things like, that character, Alexander, would not have been treated the way he was treated in rural Ireland in the late 70s, early 80s. But in reality, that's what I witnessed happening in rural Ireland, in my home village, in the mid-80s, in the late, early to mid-80s. And I know, and this is something we've discussed in UL with my colleagues, Joseph O'Connor and Sarah Moore, we talk about this a lot to students, about how just because something happened in real life, it doesn't mean it's going to feel real in fiction. And I really felt the weight of that, the truth of that, actually, because people couldn't see the realness of that in that story. They were just presuming, they had this idea that if this man arrived in Nina or its environs in the 70s or 80s, there would have been more, but I knew better.
I see. So another thing was of interest, we had the Dingle International Film Festival last weekend, and there I saw the film Fosca, based on a thing about December. And that was in the Irish language. I wondered what your relationship is with the Irish language.
I absolutely love it, I must say.
Question. Yeah.
Well, I was very lucky to have a teacher in school called Martin Scully, from third year to leaving cert, and he was just an absolute genius. I mean, he was just incredible. So, I mean, he knew that none of us had a word. After all those years of learning Irish in school, none of us had a word. And so he said, I know you're all a stick of shit, basically. I know you haven't a word. We won't even talk about it. And he went back to basics. We went back to conjugating verbs, to the very basics. And by the time we did our leaving cert, we were all getting A's and B's in Honours Irish. It was just incredible, you know. And I took that love with me, and I kind of accidentally found myself being the nominated Gilgore in several offices that I worked in civil service. Very often was with disastrous results, but you know, I was able to muddle through. But it's so beautiful. Actually, the last time I was in Dingle, I read a poem called Adaptations, the only thing I've ever written in Irish, and the audience were very kind, but I'm not sure if it's, I'm not sure exactly how it went over. But it's beautiful. I mean, and I love, one thing about Irish I love, and the relationship between the way we speak mostly in rural Ireland and Irish, is that we preserved the Irish syntax, you know, the inversion, in a really lovely way. And it allows, it gives a certain cadence, I think, to so-called Hiberno English. I hate the phrase,
indeed,
but it
yes,
does, yeah.
yeah,
And
yes.
it gives a lovely rhythm to it, yeah,
English
absolutely.
version.
Yeah.
So were you part of that decision for it to be an Irish language film?
Well, I can't remember, to be honest. I don't get too involved in rights discussions very often. And, you know, I'm reluctant sometimes about adaptations because I only ever see my novels as novels, and I can't really envision them as anything else. Even though, to me, in my imagination, they're visual and they play out. You know, the characters are actors in my imagination, and they have, you know, a very visual life in my imagination. But still, I have a kind of worry sometimes about adaptations. But I think that
to sign it off to the filmmaker.
yeah, but I think they did an incredible job on it.
It's a beautiful film.
Yeah, and actually, I love the ending, and I love that Johnsy now has a chance. You know, he's got a second life, really. Yeah,
that was very different from the book. I know that another of your great interests is climate change. I've heard you talk about that very passionately, and you even described the way that it was being taught to children as an original sin, as it was being. So, can you tell us a bit about what your
I have reservations about the way climate change is spoken about to children, and the level of guilt that is being burdened, that children are being asked to carry. It seems as though children, the starting point is that it's because of you, it's because of all of us. You know, you're human, we're all humans, we're all at fault. They're not at fault. You know, children aren't at fault. Children, you know, are incapable of being at fault for anything, really, besides the most ridiculous misdemeanors. You know, and so I think it's a very negative way of approaching it. You know, to say that there are too many people, you know, if there were fewer people, we'd have a better world. It's kind of an awful thing to say, really, isn't it? When you think about it, when you break it down. But I don't like the way it's spoken about. I don't like the way the negativity around it. I think, you know, we should be asking people to be proactive. I don't like the idea of making somebody pay, you know, 40% more for diesel in rural Ireland. That's not going to make the world a better place. It's not going to make the world cool down suddenly. You know, it's just going to make people more broke and more angry. It's ridiculous.
That's not yet in your writing, though. That's not yet in your writing?
No. Actually, I wrote a long, fiery article about this for a newspaper, and then at the last minute I pulled it because I thought it's just diatribe. It's just too much, you know. But you know, I think there needs to be a different way of looking at the situation, and I think there needs to be less blame being ascribed by corporations, by people in power. You know, I mean, I heard somebody in a position of power, and he was saying something like, "Oh, we're addicted. We're all addicted to carbon fuels." As though we decided, you know, to use gas to heat our homes or to use carbon fuels to fuel our vehicles. I mean, no one decided this. We don't have addictions. This is just the way the world is structured. But to blame ordinary people and ordinary taxpayers and ordinary workers for these things, it makes no sense.
To go back to the writing, now that you are a lecturer in creative writing in Limerick, I wondered whether there was a book or writer that you insist your students read.
Well, there are two poets actually at the moment, Mary O'Malley and Martin Dyer, who I think are on my syllabus, but it changes all the time. But I do insist that my students read Martin's poem Cyril de Bergerac and to read Mary's collection, which I have here actually. I'm going to read from it actually in a little while, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Gowden Dingle. I think they're just incredible. And there's something about just the cleanness and the precision and the beauty in their words and the compression and the amount they can say with a single word. And there's something about poetry, I think, that's instructive for all writers of prose, poetry, nonfiction, memoir, whatever you're writing, screenplays. That compression, that economy, that the weight that each word has to carry. It's beautiful.
Can we take a passage from Queen of Dirt Island
Sure.
first? That would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, these chapters are all very short. They're all exactly 500 words. And that really upsets people, certain people. Not the good readers of the world, but some people whose job it is to talk about books, to get upset by the fact that all the chapters are the exact same length. But I thought to myself, and it makes sense to me, every day of our lives is the exact same length. It takes the exact same amount of time for the world to rotate once, every single time. And some days, things happen that become part of the fabric of our souls, that changes forever. And other days, we get up and go to work and kiss our kids goodbye, and nothing happens. Some days we get up, kiss our kids goodbye, and never come home. But still, every day is the exact same length. So I thought, it makes sense for every chapter of a story to be the exact same length, to contain, some chapters will contain multitudes, and some will contain what seeming banalities, but they'll all be important. And so it also was a way of me being able to write a novel very quickly, because I had very, very little time, because I was way over deadline, and I had a dud novel behind me. And so, I could sense a kind of slight frisson of panic from my editor. And so in order to not go off on any tangents, I said I'll be very disciplined about chapter lengths and make them all the exact same length. And actually, and I thought, we ask our students in UL to write flash fiction sometimes at the start of semester, just to kind of get into the flow of it. And some of them come up with beautiful things. And actually, there's a writer here tonight called Ruth O'Shea, who's, maybe I shouldn't say it now, but anyway, she writes in vignettes, and it's just so inspiring and just so beautiful how she's able to shape these beautifully crafted pieces of life into these, into these small vignettes. And it just, I just love the idea of these small things becoming huge, or just being as they are, but having an effect. So this is called Proposal, anyway. At this point in the novel, the character of Eileen Aylward has been widowed, and she is proposed to by the brother of her late husband. And the proposal is witnessed by her daughter, Saoirse, who is 11, I think, at this point. Yeah. It's called Proposal. Chris proposed to Mother on an evening in early summer with his working clothes on him, as though he'd been seized suddenly by some amorous impulse, some wild desire that had been lying dormant. He came rushing down from the fields to the village, half-cocked, as Nana said later, though she didn't wholly disapprove of his hastily conceived and poorly executed plan. He stood a long while at the side door, mumbling. Saoirse had never seen a redder face. Mother had stepped back to let him in. She had a cigarette just lit, and she was pulling on it deeply. "Come in, Chris," she said, through a cloud of blue smoke. "I won't, Eileen. My boots are covered in muck. I won't drag it in along your clean floor. I clean my arse," said Mother, and Chris laughed, a high chuckle, the way he always did. Chris enjoyed Mother, and she liked him right back. From somewhere, from the ether or the blue heavens or the fumes of new growth or agricultural diesel, he drew courage, and he made his proposal. "Eileen, I was wondering," Saoirse heard him say. "Wondering what, Chris?" "I was wondering if it wouldn't be the best thing for all concerned if you and me, if I and you, if you and I, if me and you." And then he said it straight, nearly in a shout. "Will you marry me?" Saoirse saw Mother bend forward as though someone had struck her in the stomach, and she grabbed in her two fists the lapels of Chris's overalls and pulled him into the kitchen, slamming the door closed in the same movement. Chris's eyes were opened wide in shock. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't to be manhandled off his feet. He straightened himself and put a hand over his face and drew it downwards as if to reset himself, to regain something of his passive countenance. "What kind of rubbish are you talking, Chris?" But Chris didn't know, it seemed, what kind of rubbish he'd been talking. But on he ploughed. "We wouldn't have to, you know yourself, be married in the fullness of the word. would just, you know yourself, take the bad look off of things. You could have, you know yourself, a bit of company. Yourself and the baby. Baby. Saoirse was 11 years old, and she opened her mouth to protest this slight, but some vague wisdom rose from within her and silenced her. Paddy and Chris, her uncles, called her the baby, and maybe they always would. I love you dearly, Chris, said Mother, and I'd be a lucky, lucky woman if I were free to marry you. But I'm still, in my heart and my soul, married to your brother, and it will be, I'd say, for all of eternity. Chris said it was okay. He was sorry. And Mother said she was sorry too, and she kissed his cheek. And Chris dragged himself back up the hillside, and he didn't come down again for a long, long time. Well, Chris, thanks very much. Apologies for my sinuses.
Do you want to read us one of the poems?
Yeah, no, I will. Is it epigram or epigraph that started the book? Epigram, is it?
Epigraph.
I'm not sure. Epigraph. Oh, thank you. Oh, this is my upside down book, by the way. This is the only dud book that came in the batch that Kenny's published. Kenny's Bookshop in Galway published their own version of the book, the Kenny Special Edition. It has a foreword and an extra chapter. And this is an upside down one. This is the one they gave me.
You understand?
They didn't know though. They didn't know, in fairness, now. But actually, I think it's great. I find
unique.
Yeah,
It is,
unique, absolutely. But I get confused. Here we go now. Oh yeah, wrong book anyway. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read. The epigraph in the book is just the final verse of Mary O'Malley's poem History. But I'll read the whole poem, and I'd like to dedicate the poem and the reading of this poem by Mary O'Malley to the memory of Vicky Phelan. History by Mary O'Malley. This story is about a mother and a daughter, a God taking what he wanted. Demeter's girl. All we know of them is hearsay. Some figures and vases. The woman with her sheaf of corn. Her rage stopped the harvest. Bare shelves brought the gods to the table. This story is about a bargain and a trick. A young girl eating a pomegranate, a seed in her teeth. The girl has no say in our best-known versions. We see her climbing from the dark, eyes hurting, the light x-raying her bones. Year in, year out, Demeter might have said, stay if it's easier, let the crops rot. But the myth needed growth. This is no time for shady business, the bargains and chains. We too live in important places. Let the books remember the local battles. Rewrite the plot. Let the harvest wither. This is your life. She is your great event. Keep her in the sun.
Okay.
That's from Mary O'Malley.
Mary O'Malley. So one more question, Donal, and then maybe
Yes.
we'll throw it open to the audience. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm reluctant to say, Camilla, because of the disaster of the novel that didn't work out. Because I've been going around the world, actually, talking joyfully about that novel, thinking I was a great fella. And, it was coming out the following year and describing it to people and telling them what it was about. And, talking about the main character and reading from it, actually. Before my editor had even seen it. I was so convinced it was a work of genius. It was my opus. So, but I will say, because I think this time I'm on safer ground, the next book is a direct sequel to The Queen of Dirt Island. And I kind of set the sequel up in the last chapter. So if you have read the book, you'll probably know, the kind of the meat of the sequel or who it's going to be about. Pearl.
We do have the same characters coming in from other Isabel novels, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah, because
Yes,
some
which is
characters I
nice.
miss, yeah.
Yes, it's kind of, Elizabeth Strout does the same thing.
She does, yeah.
With her a lot, yes.
Jim Gilday actually is a character who's in all my novels. He's a sergeant, and he's in all my novels, and he is in nearly all of my short stories. And he's such a strong character, he even turns up in other people's novels.
Now, should we throw this open to would anyone like to ask a question of Donal? I'll put on my spectacles and hope I can see a roving mic. Would you like to start? Would anyone stand up and have a question?
My favourite word in your book is oligoning.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering where that came from. It's a great word.
I keep meaning to find out the etymology of oligone. I know it's based on an Irish word, but I'm not quite sure what that word is. But it's something to do with... Is it the same word? Oh, great stuff. So it's given out and complaining and me on, really, you know. We say me all Latin tip, and I suppose me all, I mean, bad luck, isn't it? Like, oh, I'm so unfortunate, you know, me all. I will stop me on about that. So you can Olagon and me all. I think me on is kind of another level of Olagoning. Yeah. I use Olagoning a lot, actually. I love it. And I love being in America reading and people going, Donal, can I just ask you what Olagoning means? And I love it. And it gets extended even further in an American accent. You know, it's lovely.
I can't really see. There's somebody over there. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Hi, Donal. Just wondering how much of, let's say, your current book is about your own upbringing and, let's say, phrases. You mentioned your nana, and how many phrases would have been borrowed from your own. And does that ever get you into trouble with your siblings, saying you shouldn't have used that?
It's a great question. Yeah. I love this question, actually. And I mean, this book is almost a cheat, really. You know, I lifted everything from the people dearest to me in the world, and the people who loved me and protected me and shaped me into the person I am. And then I just took all of their private moments and put them into a book. Yeah, and it was a bit of trouble, all right, but it blew over very quickly. You know, we don't tend to hold grudges in my family, thank God. But it's amazing when a person is convinced they're in a book and they're completely wrong, how convinced they will be. You know, and I've had virtual strangers tell me they'll never talk to me again. People have barely spoken to my life. I was just so convinced I took their lives and used them for my fiction. But my mom read this book, as she always does, as a pile of A4 pages. You know, she read the very first draft and she finished it. And she went, yeah, it's fairly good, all right, yeah. But Jesus, that one, Eileen, where'd you get her from? She literally could see none of herself. She could not see herself in Eileen at all. And I mean, is this being recorded, actually? Okay, I'll say it anyway. There's a moment in the book where a character is pregnant and she's quite young, and the mother in the book gives out, you know. And I remember, you know, the same conversation pretty much happening in my house. So that chapter is pretty much verbatim. There was no effort at all. I just channeled my memory of that, you know, and I don't even full stop in the chapter. It's just a constant stream of expletives.
You spent a lot of time listening at doors, did you?
Well, I didn't have to, because voices were generally very raised, you know.
Anyone else?
We didn't have private conversations.
One here, please.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on the scene where Saoirse's friend or classmate arrives up to the mom to the house to give out about Saoirse's potential behavior with her boyfriend, and then how shocking it was to read about the headbutt. And then I absolutely love, and it makes me shriek randomly, the reaction of Saoirse when she said I can't remember the exact quote, but she says you know, you're anticipating that she's going to be absolutely like blown away by what she's looking at her mother headbutting a child. But she feels so sorry for anybody who doesn't have a mother like hers. And it's just, I love it. It's just such an amazing scene. And I just want to know how much license did you take there? Did you do that to shock?
Well, I watched my mother once beat up 2 Jehovah's Witnesses in the yard of our house because, now, not because they were Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, obviously not, but they had walked into the house and left the gate open for about the 4th time. And she kept saying, I don't want to buy the watchtower. Please don't leave my front gate open. I have a creche here. Children could run out onto the road. So the 4th time they did it, I remember she ran out with a brush out of the house and she broke the brush to smithereens off these poor people. But I mean, they were asking for it, you know. I mean, she told them, you know. So I did channel some of that energy for that scene. Yeah. Please edit that from the recording.
Hi there, Jane Buckley. Quick question. I've started to write recently, but
Where are you?
I'm down here.
Oh,
yeah, sorry. I started to write recently, but what I found to my disappointment is that I find it difficult to read other books. I've actually stopped reading. Do you get time to read, and do you understand what I'm sort of trying to explain?
That's very interesting. When I sat down to write seriously. And I mean, you know, it took my wife having a pregnancy addiction to a TV show called America's Next Top Model for me to be able to become a so-called serious writer, because she was pregnant and she knew, a frustrated novelist. And I was, you know, and I'd been recently promoted in my job, so I was quite busy. But when I came home, I wouldn't stop talking. And she was just sick of me. And she just wanted to watch this TV show, and it was on all the time. It was on in the morning, noon, and night on this TV channel called Living, and she was just obsessed with it. And so I wouldn't shut up. And she said, "Will you just please shut up?" You know. And also, I just must be a writer. Why don't you spend your spare time upstairs writing a novel you're always on about? So that's when I became a writer. But I did find straight away I couldn't read. That if I did read, that the reading leaked into what I was writing very quickly. And I suppose because I hadn't quite found my voice fully or struck my own note, and I was still in that kind of very open, pliable, malleable place, which is a great place to be. And I think we're always going to be influenced by what we read and what we come across. And our reading life is going to have a huge effect on our writing life, necessarily, because the only real apprenticeship you can serve as a writer is as a reader. But I do find sometimes that I can't. Yeah, I find that reading falls away. And I also find these days, and I think many of you will feel the same, that reading is a real luxury. To find the time to read can be so hard. And maybe our concentration has been narrowed down by social media or by the way that news is delivered now or the way we receive information. But it can be tricky, all right. But I do think that we have to make ourselves read, because it keeps language warm and alive. You know, I mean, language is very limited, and so we have to have as much of it as we can. We need to be greedy about language as writers. We need to get all the words in, you know, because was it Wittgenstein who said that language as the vehicle of thought is the great paradox of existence? We can never express anything fully in words, so we need as many words as possible and as many ways of saying things and as many phrases. We need language to be as flexible as possible, I think. So I think you have to really force yourself. And I think actually we had a writer in residence, Gavin McRae. He's a fantastic writer. His memoir Cells just came out actually. Yesterday it was launched. About his mother, actually. He's a memoir by his mum. It's fantastic. And he said, you know, you should set yourself a task every day of reading at least 20 pages. Now, Gavin specifies Proust, but I wouldn't specify Proust, but that's what he says. But it's a good thing to do, I think, to say, I'll read 20 pages. It's not that much, you know, it's a few minutes of reading. And you'll get through a book in a few weeks. That's, you know, about 20 books a year. What's that? Of course, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Donal. That's been very enlightening and fascinating to
My
hear
pleasure.
your...
Is there one more?
Oh, there was another one. Sorry, is there another person there? There's somebody in the front here would like to... Is that Orna? Yes.
I wanted to ask you about your grandmother and her banned books.
Yes.
2 questions. Number 1, did she share them with you? And number 2, how did she procure them?
I know I shouldn't use the phrase Underground Railroad because, you know, it has such connotations, but it kind of was that way. They were smuggled to North Tipperary from England by ferries, by vans, truck drivers, people who were delivering cattle or taking cattle away, were, you know, moving books around the country. Genuinely, there was a real network of banned books around the country at the time. Edna O'Brien was from Scariff, just across the river from us, and she was related to my grandmother. And my grandmother used to babysit her, actually. She was a bit older than her. And so she was just fascinated by the idea that Edna had written a book. And my grandmother apparently was a great reader. And it's a lovely thing, but they were all burnt accidentally. All of her books, yeah. It's really, really tragic. The person who, my aunt-in-law, who, you know, was clearing the house out and burning what she thought was just old, kind of dusty things that weren't needed for anything, accidentally, you know, included them in the bonfire. And to this day, she can't think about it. You know, her voice cracks and breaks down when she thinks about it. I mean, all of the effort of all those years of smuggling books around and hiding them and giving them out and getting them back and minding them. It's terrible.
Any other more? No?
How you doing?
How are you doing?
I suppose we're living in an era of where misappropriation now is, you know, kind of the thing that's really been discussed. And, you know, I suppose now in retrospect, you know, Joyce's Ulysses trying to write through the female voice, the lens is, you know, it's garnered article upon article. How did you, I suppose, approach writing through that female lens? And have you experience much backlash afterwards? And secondly, I remember we had you down in Waterford University and you gave us a talk and you were talking about the dependence you have on your wife when you're writing and how much of an influence was she, I suppose, on the book too.
Well, there's a strong rumour in West Limerick that Anne-Marie writes all the books. And puts steals all her neighbours' and friends' stories, and she puts my name to them. It's not true, no. But she does, I mean, I always say this, and I have been accused of the terrible crime of uxoriousness, apparently in Victorian times. If you were too fond of your wife, or if you ascribed too much intelligence to your wife, you were accused of being uxorious. And I was accused of this on Twitter, actually, by a guy, you know, an anonymous guy. People are very brave anonymously, and they'll say anything to you, but they wouldn't say to your face. Anyway, I wouldn't be a writer only for her, and she has a really natural, inherent talent for editing and for telling me when something's no good. It's amazing. And I do rely on her, absolutely. And, you know, I think because I didn't involve her enough in the writing of the failed novel day by day, that's why it failed, seriously. I wouldn't have failed if she'd been stewarding it a little bit more. But it genuinely is a case of Anne-Marie reading the 3 or 4 pages I've written that day. And I have to wait for a certain expression to cross her face. And she doesn't know what the expression is. And she doesn't really know that I do this because I stand at an oblique angle from her. And if I don't see that particular expression, I know it's wrong. It really is, it's kind of unspoken, you know, because she tends to say the same things pretty much about the writing. So, yeah, it's very good though, well done, yeah. But I know. And then maybe later on, when she's thought about it, she'll give me a more detailed analysis. But she is a very, very important part of the process for me. And without her, I mean, I said in this book at the end of it, she's the person to whom I owe every single word. It really is true. There wouldn't be a word in existence without her. And she's incredible, you know, she's an incredible human being. And the thing about appropriation is we have to just ignore it. But still, we have to have the idea in our minds at all times that, as Kit Duval says, truthfully and profoundly, we can't dip our pens in somebody else's blood. So we have to have respect. You know, I mean, I think you have to have your homework done. You can't go off half-cocked about a person or a place or a thing or a situation. But still, at the end of the day, almost everything about human condition is ineffable. You know, and going back to that idea of language as the vehicle of thought or the vehicle of the human condition, it's impossible. You're always guessing no matter what. But it's very important not to lampoon or mimic or be disrespectful or reductive about another human being. And that's it, really. You know, it's the only rule. And other than that, the world is your oyster completely and utterly as a writer. You can go anywhere you want.
It's good to hear. Anyone else? Thank you, Donal.
Well, thank you, Camilla. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.